Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to this NQA webinar. We're going to be having a look today at aspects and impacts. So you should be able to see the title on the screen, Stay Environment Savvy with Aspects and Impacts. One of the things we're looking at doing within NQA is running a series of back to basics, going back and looking at certain aspects, certain elements of a standard, no pun there, aspect. We're going to look at certain bits of the standard and maybe go back to basics and make sure that we're all happy, we're all okay with what's required, what the intentions are, and maybe have a look at a little bit of advice around those particular areas. My name is Richard Walsh. I'm NQA's Principal Assessor for Energy and Environment. Looking down the list of attendees, there's a number of names that I recognise, people that have followed me through many audits, first of all, and also webinars. So welcome, nice to see you all or hear from you, and also if you're new to joining any of these webinars again, you're very welcome. Now, I'm getting a note saying no slide showing. Can anybody else confirm whether they can see the slides? If somebody could just say whether they can and whether it's Chris, whether it's your computer that's yeah. So yeah, thank you. That's enough. That's enough. Yeah, you should all be able to see the title page. Thank you. Yeah, it's enough. Thank you. So I do apologise, Chris. If you can't see the slides, it's probably something at your end, not at our end. So enough people can see the slide. Oh, Chris has left. Okay, whether he's going to rejoin, maybe not. Okay, anyway, let's crack on. So this afternoon we're going to be looking at, as the title says, we're going to be looking at environmental aspects and impacts. And let me just come back over here. So just a couple of little bits about NQA. If you've not joined a webinar before, that tells you who we are. We've been around since 1988 and are one of the top 4 certification bodies here in the UK in terms of number of certificates, and we operate in over 90 countries around the world. Obviously, this presentation is being brought to you as part of our sort of training and awareness arm. And again, I always joke, I'm contractually obliged to show you a couple of slides at the start, just to show you a little bit about who we are and what we have. And that just shows a little bit about the different areas that we can offer training and awareness in: quality, environment, energy. Obviously, my 2 areas, environment and energy. And we are pushing very heavily now on sustainability, which picks up on carbon, particularly carbon neutrality, doing a lot of work on that just at the moment. And I had some webinars a few weeks ago on PAS 2060 and net zero. Those that haven't seen me before, that's me. As I say, NQA's Principal Assessor, Energy and Environment, or Environment and Energy. I've been at NQA since 2007. My background is as an engineer. I'm a metallurgist and spent a long number of years working in the automotive industry before I moved across into environment, probably in the early 90s. So that's me. Just a little bit of information, a bit of housekeeping. We're probably going to speak, or I'm probably going to speak for about half an hour, just over, maybe 35-40 minutes. Where you all typing, yes, I can see, etc., etc. You can ask questions as we go along, and please do. And if there are any questions that you have as we go along, I'll try and answer them, or we'll save them to the end. Might be a bit of both. Already got a question from Amanda. Yes, you will get the slides after the webinar. So as you see on the slide in front of you, at the end of the webinar, probably it may be early next week now, but we will send the slides out. We send the slides out in PDF form. Everybody who's registered on the webinar, whether they've attended or not, gets a copy of the slides. And we're also recording the webinar, and you will also get a link We post all our webinars on YouTube, and if you want to ever use any of them for CPD, if you search for NQA on YouTube, we have a channel, and all the webinars we've ever presented going back 5 or 6 years now are all on there, covering a wide range of subjects, as you saw earlier: quality, health and safety, environment, information security, food safety, all the different standards that we certify. So you don't need to scribble frantically. You will get a copy of the slides, and you will also get a link to the recording of the webinar itself. Okay, so I'm going the wrong way now, just a second. There we go. Right, so what we're going to look at today, we always go back to basics with any of these presentations. That's what the whole point is. And we're going to think about, what exactly is the environment, what does it mean to your business, and why do we need to develop our interest in the environment. The standard itself describes the environment as the surroundings in which we operate, including air, water, land, natural resources, flora, fauna, humans, and the interrelationships between all of the aforementioned. And where I'm quoting from the standard, you will see that we do put a little section to reference where that's come from. So that is basically what we're thinking about. And when we're looking at aspects and impacts, we're thinking about how we as an organisation, what is it that we do, and what is it that we do in terms of how it impacts on the environment. So that's the aspects and the impact. And as we'll see, one aspect can have a number of impacts, and we'll see that. So the aspect is the thing that we do that can affect the environment, and the impact is the actual change or impact, as the name suggests, on the environment itself. There's a number of reasons people might look at management systems, and I've already noticed a slight spelling mistake in that presentation. I've just made a note. It says at the top ENMS. Some of the slides that I've used for this have been pulled from a presentation that we use for energy management, and ENMS is an energy management system, but it's still exactly the same issue. So just pretend it says EMS at the top. We'll get that changed. Obviously, there are pressures and there are incentives for organisations to think about environment, think about improving the environment, and making sure that you are aware of all the different areas that your activities, all the areas that can impact on the environment, both positive and negative. So the pressures that we get, of course, you've only got to switch the TV on these days and people are talking about the environment, they're talking about climate change, they're talking about global warming. That's a bit of an old term now. And we're talking constantly about how we as human beings are having an impact on the planet. So there's an awful lot of public concerns about use of resources, about pollution, and particularly around how we have an impact on the climate. Legislation, environmental legislation is one of the biggest areas of legislation. It's certainly one of the fastest growing areas of legislation, constantly changing. And one of the difficulties for people like myself, or maybe people who have sites in different parts of the UK, environmental legislation is a devolved responsibility. So therefore, there are certain requirements that differ, depends on whether you're in England, Wales, Scotland, or indeed Northern Ireland. So there are a number of areas, UK, EU, and international protocols that also drive our environmental behaviour. We're increasingly seeing taxes being used by the government to actually force people into change. The climate change levy, the landfill tax, there's a plastic tax now, depends on if you're using plastic packaging, the amount of recycled material, and using taxes as a way of changing behaviour is another popular way. You could argue that taxes are always a popular way for governments to collect money, but they're seen as a way of forcing people to change and making the alternatives more cost effective. A good example of that would be about 18 months ago now, there was a ban on most people using red diesel. And what that was all about was making the alternatives, be they hydrogen powered, be they solar powered, whatever it might be, making those alternatives more cost effective. And then, of course, the whole thing around sustainability, again, another very key phrase at the moment, sustainability. And again, it comes back to the sort of tying in with the public concerns. Resources, uses of energy, we're using finite resources, energy, water, and the biodiversity, the wildlife, the flora, the fauna around us. So, clause 612, this is the main clause that we're going to be looking at within the standard, within ISO 14001:2015. So, that clause, pardon me, is all about environmental aspects. And again, the standard defines in sections 322 and 324, which are the sections that define various terms. So an aspect is defined as an element of an organization's activities, products or services that can interact with the environment. And then the impact, as I've alluded to already, is any changes to the environment, whether adverse or beneficial, wholly or partially resulting from the organization's environmental aspects. So that's the difference between an aspect and an impact. The aspect is something that we do that can interact with the environment, and the impact is the actual change to the environment. And I've seen so many aspects registers that get that wrong, that actually list out the impacts as aspects. So things like water pollution, and that is an impact. If you're polluting water, the aspect will be whatever it is that's discharging into a river. The impact will be the pollution of a stream, a lake, or whatever it might be. And we quite often see that wrong, that people misunderstand what is an aspect and what is the associated impact. So what does this clause actually ask us to do? What does it say we have to do? It is prescriptive, but it gives us quite a lot of wriggle room as to how we might cope with this requirement. So it talks about within the defined scope of the management system. So that's the first thing that we need to bear in mind. Every environmental management system, in fact, any management system, be it environment, quality, health and safety, has a scope. And the scope of the system defines the boundaries around which this system operates. So within the defined scope of the system, the organisation should determine the aspects of its activities, products or services, and this is the important bit, that it can control, that it can influence, and to then think about the associated impacts considering a life cycle perspective. And we'll come back to look at that phrase, considering a life cycle perspective, a little bit later on. So we've only to think about things within the scope of the system, and things that we can control and things that we can influence. And as we're going through that process, we then need to take into account changes, any planned or new developments, new or modified activities, products and services. So we'll look at that first. So I say to my clients when I'm auditing them, this is not a once in a lifetime activity. The aspects register should be a live document. So if you amend the process, if you start using a different product, if you start changing the energy sources, the way that you're using energy, if you decide you're going to extend the factory and put up a new building, all of these are changes, planned new developments, or maybe we're modifying an activity, we're modifying a product. We're offering a new service. We might offer a home delivery service, for example. That's all changing the aspects and obviously the associated impacts. And then for each of the aspects, we need to think about how things operate normally how things might operate abnormally, and then reasonably foreseeable emergency situations. Now, I always say that crystal balls are in short supply. We can't necessarily see exactly what's going to happen, but there are things that might happen. I won't say too much, but one of our clients was in the news the other day with an anaerobic digestion plant that was hit by lightning. Could they have foreseen that? I don't know. But that was a quite spectacular emergency situation. And had they planned for that, that's what they needed to think about. An abnormal condition is when something is running, this might sound silly, not in the normal way. So for instance, a process might take half an hour to get up to speed. It might take some time to start running effectively. So maybe in the first 15-20 minutes, the emissions from a process might be worse because it's not up to temperature. For instance, again, as an example, if you are checking the emissions from your car, or you're having your car MOT'd and somebody else is checking the emissions, they will wait till the car is up to temperature before they actually check the emissions, because in the first 5 or 10 minutes while the engine's cold, the emissions are not considered normal. So you need to think about, are there any abnormal operating conditions? I've also seen people talk about times of the year when a lot more paperwork is generated, maybe around a year end, and there's suddenly a lot more paper. I've worked with organisations that have to send out lots and lots of reports and things at year end, so their use of paper in April goes through the roof, not compared to the rest of the year. So there's lots and lots of areas that we might think about that might be considered as abnormal. So we need to think about change. And we need to also be bearing in mind when we're setting these up, what are the normal and the abnormal conditions, and think about what could go wrong. And of course, if it goes wrong, what might we do about it? So again, sticking with the clause, because this is what we're aiming to ensure that we're in line with and making the most of. So the organisation shall determine those aspects that have or can have a significant environmental impact. So it doesn't ask us to completely have records of absolutely every last little thing that we do. You know, we're not looking for steam that comes off the kettle. We're not looking for a little bit of paper that goes in a waste paper bin. It's asking us to think about how a method by which we can sort out the wheat from the chaff. We can sort out the significant from the non-significant. Because at the end of the day, this process is asking us to come up with what are the significant areas. Now, I've had people say to me, I'm only a small company. There's only 15 of us in this business. Yet down the road, there's a huge chemical plant. We're not significant when we're compared to them. And absolutely they're not. However, significance is within your own scope of your own standard, your own site. You're not comparing your significance with somebody else's significance. You're comparing yourself, or you're looking at your own activities, and you're making sure that your own aspects are ranked in order of significance, so that at the end of the day, because the significant aspects, significant impacts, will actually then start to feed into your organization's objectives and targets. And one of the things we look for is, on an audit, we look to see, have the aspects and impacts that are ranked as significant, have they made their way through into the objectives and targets? Because when you look at that particular clause, which we're not going to do today, it says, in terms of setting objectives and targets, you have to consider significant aspects. So it's all about making sure that you understand what is significant. Now, when I said that the standard is prescriptive, but there's lots and lots of wiggle room, it doesn't tell us how we have to sort out significance. there are many, many different ways of doing it. I see a lot of people that use the traditional sort of health and safety risk assessment approach that look at severity and likelihood with a 1 to 5 matrix and come up with a score between 1 and 25. And then you've probably all seen them, use a little matrix with sort of red, amber and green. And the reds and possibly some of the ambers become significant, and the lower ambers and the greens are parked to one side. But there is no set way of coming up with significance. All that happens is I explain, or I ask my clients to explain to me how they have come up with significance. And my test, I've audited so many different businesses now that I tend to know what is likely to be significant in every sector. And I make a judgment. Is what the client is telling me is significant? Is it what I think that business's significance should be? And if it is, then the chances are that the process has worked. You know, if it's a large chemical plant and the most significant item is photocopying paper, I'm probably going to go back and say, maybe let's have a little bit of a deeper dig, should I say, into your significance process. But the standard doesn't tell us how we do it. The standard does require that we maintain documented information. Now, that can be electronic or it can be hard copy of the aspects and associated impacts. So that's all of them. So in order to work out the significance, we do have to start off with a list of them all. Then the methodology used for determining significance, that should be documented. And then finally, the list, the final, whatever you want to call it, table of significant environmental aspects and their associated impacts, that possibly should say. So that's what we're looking for as assessors in this particular clause of the standard. So just to come back and start to put some actual examples in there. So this is a similar slide to what we saw earlier, but we're now putting in some examples. So an environmental aspect would be energy use. You could even be a little bit further and say gas. That might be a good example. Use of gas for heating, whether that's process heating, whether that is heating the office. The associated impact from that, for example, is emissions of carbon leading to climate change. So that would be one way of identifying what the aspect is and then what the impact itself is. And a significant aspect could have or can have significant impacts. And remember, it's those that you can control and can influence. So if you're using electricity, you've very little control over where that electricity is generated. And we come on to this when we think about the life cycle approach, which we'll talk about later. One of the questions I got asked the most when this standard, I still call it the new standard, when the 2015 standard was published, I used to get questions about how far up the supply chain should we go? How far down the supply chain, down the sort of sales chain should we go? And I'll come on to that. I'll answer that question as I answered it when I was asked this question 7 or 8 years ago on another webinar. So we need to consider everything. And there's many, many ways of doing this, and this isn't the only way. This is one of the ways that we've sort of drawn up as an example of what you might like to consider. And it's thinking about using a process approach. The standard itself says we have to use a process approach. We have to audit using a process approach, and you have to manage your environmental aspects, also using a this similar approach. So a process has got inputs and the process has got outputs. Now this already starts to help us think about the life cycle approach. Now the standard doesn't say you have to do a full life cycle assessment. It says you have to consider a life cycle approach, and that is what this is starting to get us to think about. So what are our inputs? Raw materials, energy, oil, petrol, diesel, electricity, gas, steam, I've come across. Are we buying in components? Are we buying in ready-made components that we're just assembling? Are we buying in components that we have to machine? I used to work in engineering. The company I worked for bought in castings that we machined and then assembled and sent out. All of those are items that we purchased, we had delivered, and are manufactured on our behalf. And again, we have to think about the upstream environmental impact, but only those that we can control or influence. We then have our own processes. So we've got the normal conditions, everyday activities, when the business is running normally, when the factory is running normally, everything's running fine, that's a normal condition. We may have abnormal conditions. Now, I alluded to some, there's some more there, maybe when we do carrying out maintenance activities. Again, a number of manufacturing companies I work with have a shutdown week in the summer when the place shuts down and everybody goes on holiday apart from the maintenance teams. And then they come in and start stripping machines down, changing oils, changing lubricants, servicing machinery, things like that. That would again be considered an abnormal condition. The use of subcontractors coming onto site to carry out an activity that you might not normally be doing yourself, that's an abnormal condition. And then, as I've alluded to, emergency situations, fire, spills, weather-related, seeing more and more of that, flooding, that's a good example. And then the outputs. So we've got intended outputs, so the thing that we're producing, the products that we're selling, the finished goods, or maybe the service that we're offering. It calls them unintended outputs. I'm not 100% sure that's the right phrase, but you might have scrap, so things that actually, components that are not acceptable, but you will still have waste, and waste obviously would be an unintended, waste would be an intended output. It just depends on the level. And actually, that's an interesting question that's just been asked, which I'm just going to move this so I can see the whole of the question. Thanks, Mark. Would rework or remanufacturing products rejected by a customer be included as abnormal conditions? I guess it depends what you're having to do to them. If they're coming back onto site and you are still using the same process, then possibly not. If you're having to do something different to them that you wouldn't normally do, then I would say yes, that would be considered abnormal. The handling and dealing with customer rejects, obviously it's a quality issue, but yes, from an environmental perspective, you would look at, are we having to do anything different to these returned products? And as part of the rework, we may have to sort them. It may end up with a higher degree of waste because we might have to strip them down and end up throwing away some of the components that might be incorrect. I don't know. I'm thinking off the top of my head now, but generally, I would say, Mark, yes, that most of this that we're talking about, very little of it is black and white, and it might sound a cop out when I say, well, it depends, but actually. It does depend. It depends on what you're having to do to that work when it comes back onto site. As I say, if it's being treated as part of your normal processes, then probably not. If it involves some additional processes that are not normally carried out, then it would be considered abnormal. I think there's another question there. So talked about climate, the impacts on climate change, severe weather. Is this an emergency or an abnormal situation? Well, again, weather related, it could be abnormal, it could be emergency, depends on the impact on you. If the place is flooded to a depth of 2 meters, then that's clearly going to be an emergency situation. If because it's raining and you have to do things slightly differently, either bring work inside or consider alternative ways of managing something because of the heavy rain, or indeed in summer. Interesting when we're looking at energy management particularly, and of course energy is part of 14,001, not to the same extent that it is in 50,001. You might argue that a heat wave could be considered as an abnormal operation because you need an additional amount of cooling, or a severe winter where you have to use a lot more heating. That could also be considered abnormal, correct. Right, I'm just going to move on because obviously I don't want to keep you all afternoon. We've been going half an hour and we're about halfway through the slides. And I said I was going to try and talk for about 40 minutes, but that's fine. Okay, again, so just other ways of thinking about environmental aspects using different sort of process methods, and also thinking about some of the I suppose, what I would call indirect outputs rather than maybe unintended. So things like air emissions, nuisance is an area we quite often forget about. I'm actually on site at the moment. I'm with a client. I'm in Liverpool. I'm on a site, and there are houses immediately on the boundary of the site, and those houses have every right to expect a bit of peace and quiet sometimes, and there may well be noise. There can be dust. The site have at support, and obviously there's goods coming out of the port. There's aggregates coming in. There's sand coming in. And emissions and nuisances, dust on somebody. You've got dust all over your car after a particularly windy day. That would be considered a nuisance. That is an environmental impact. So there's lots and lots of things that we need to be thinking about. Okay, now why is that just not moving on? There we go. So again, just considering this sort of approach to thinking about what the aspects are and then thinking about the impacts. So that this again is the closest we're going to get on a webinar like this to like a case study. So, you know, a manufacturing company, following areas, you know, they've got financial, commercial, business areas, they've got quality, they're doing health and safety, employment, legislation, environmental issues. So some of their aspects would be atmospheric emissions, effluent disposal, waste disposal, possibly on land. So again, I work with a number of food companies who actually spread waste onto land to actually give the land some beneficial input. You might argue that's a positive aspect or positive impact. Remember, the standard said positive and negative, beneficial as well as damaging. Energy and water consumption, packaging that's used, road transport, all of those sorts of things are considered aspects from the business. And each of those will have an impact. So you could argue, if we just take road transport as the bottom one, noise and vibration, congestion, exhaust fumes, issues around local air quality, smog, global warming, depletion of natural resources. You're using diesel, you're using a finite resource. All of those environmental impacts could be set aside the one aspect of road transport. So you need to be thinking about each aspect and then thinking about all of the different ways that that aspect interacts with the environment and all of the things that it can cause, all of the damage that it can cause, but also, do any of the aspects have a positive impact? As I've said, you know, I have a couple of clients who use some of the waste from the food manufacturing process and quite legitimately and legally then spread some of that on farmland rather than it just being disposed of. And that again is providing some benefit. So we need to think about positives and negatives. And again, other examples, office work, people think, oh, well, I've only got an office, we don't do much in here, so actually we're not going to have many issues. We've got electricity consumption, water consumption, generation of wastewater, potential for our air conditioning units. It's probably not now ozone depleting substances, more likely F-gases as they're known. Air conditioning units leak. We're generating waste. We've got what's known as waste electronic and waste electrical and electronic equipment contain a huge amount of heavy metals. Again, there's an increasing need to try and recover some of those rather than just burying them in the ground as we've done in the past. Similarly, and we're just trying to think of some various sort of sectors that we can look at here, vehicle maintenance. A lot of organisations I work with may not have, that may not be their main area of work, but they all have some sort of a maintenance sheds, vehicle maintenance quite possibly, generation of hazardous wastes, oils, oil-soaked rags and cleaning cloths, consumption of petrol and diesel, noise, using electricity, generating non-hazardous solid waste, water consumption, wastewater generation, releases of volatile compounds, so from solvents that are maybe used for degreasing, things like that, all of the different things, different areas that we can, have to consider. So to try and put this into some sort of tabular format, just to give you some examples of one aspect, and then the examples of potential impacts. Air emissions. So one thing that's emitting, that's causing an air emission, can have a number of impacts. Pollution, ozone depletion, greenhouse gas contributions. I'm not going to read them all out because you're quite capable of seeing what's on the slide for yourself. Energy and fuel consumption. You're using a finite resource, that's not there, but you're using a finite resource. Contributions to greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution, climate change, noise emissions, statutory nuisance it's known as, vibration damage. All of these are things that we would have to consider. Oil spills, if we have an oil spill. Now an oil spill is an emergency issue. It's still an aspect, but the emergency could be we're altering habitat, we're doing ecological damage. There's all the issues around cleanup. How are we going to clean it up? How are we going to dispose and disperse the hazardous materials? This is back to this life cycle. Discharges of wastewater, contamination of groundwater, and then generation of normal waste, solid material disposal, hazardous material, human health impacts, etc., etc. So what the standard asks us to think about is, it doesn't use the term register of environmental aspects, but there has to be some methodology of documenting, as the standard requires, what the significant aspects and associated impacts are, and describing the methodology undertaken to get to those areas of significance. And as I've said, this identification can be carried out in a number of different ways. An initial review, go back to basics. What is it that we do as a business? Think about all the different activities that happen both on and off site. Maybe think about process flow diagrams. As we saw earlier, what are the inputs? What does a particular process need? What does it need to function? What are the indirect inputs to that process? Does it need energy? Does it need water? What are the indirect outputs? Does it give off heat? Does it give off steam? Does it give off dust? Do we need to have extraction? Do we need to put stuff up a chimney to get it away from the workforce? Because obviously there are issues around dust and things like that. And then, you know, what happens to the output from that process? Does the intended output of that process then become the input to the next process? Or does it then get packaged and go out on a lorry to be delivered? So process flow diagrams, taking observations. I'm always on my audits walking around and saying, hang on, what's going on here? What's this? Where's this documented? Oh, I've not seen that before. One of the best things any of you can do is to walk around your site with your eyes open, looking at things, be nosy. I do this all the time. I have a reputation for looking in bins and kicking oil drums just to see if there's anything in them. And that's the best way. Walk around, look and see what's actually going on, but also speak to the people who've got knowledges of the processes themselves. that's also a good source of information. There are a couple of other questions I haven't forgotten yet. We will come back to them. So, in terms of determining significance criteria, how do we go about doing that? So, having got a list of everything that we think that we do and all the different ways it can impact on the environment, we have to determine, we have to pull out those that we consider to be significant. And whatever method we use, that has to be defined, it has to be documented within our environmental management system. As I mentioned earlier, the most popular way of doing it now is to use a similar process to a health and safety risk assessment, because at the end of the day, that's what we're doing a risk assessment. So therefore, likelihood of it occurring, and if it does occur, how severe is it? So is it something that happens all the time? In other words, the likelihood is going to be 5. Or is it something that only happens occasionally? And what you tend to find is the normal aspects and their associated impacts happen all the time, but hopefully the impact is relatively low because we're controlling it. The emergency things, so if we take the thing that was in the news the other day, a lightning strike on an anaerobic digester, that doesn't happen very often. In fact, I can't remember it happening previously. I'm sure it has at some point. So that will have a likelihood of 1. But the actual environmental impact is going to be great. It's going to be probably as high as it can go, although nobody was injured. But that's something that we might think about. So it's a bit of a balance. So the things that happen all the time should have a relatively low impact, and the emergency issues that shouldn't happen very often are going to have a much higher impact if they do. So we can think about likelihood and severity. We can also think about legislation. So quite often a good guide is, if there's a piece of law or piece of legislation that covers that activity, isn't that a clue that somebody somewhere has thought, actually we need to control that because it's significant? So 1 or 2 clients that I work with have taken the decision, as an example, that if something has a legislative requirement against it, by definition, it is immediately significant. Because if it didn't have a piece of legislation covering it, it probably wouldn't be significant. So a good example, oil storage, how we store drums of oil, IBCs of oil, larger containers of oil. Depends on where you are in the UK, but there are slightly different requirements. But generally, all the different nations of the UK do have, in some form or another, a piece of legislation covering how we store oil in quantities of over 200 litres. So the fact, to me, that would say is, if we're storing oil that is covered by that legislation, I would argue that by definition that is a significant impact. Also think about the views of interested parties. So for example, the site I'm working on at the moment, that, as I say, there are people immediately over the fence. It's a site with a lot of vehicle movements. It's a site with a lot of aggregates and dust coming in from ships. So therefore, how the site interacts with its neighbours, those neighbours are interested parties. So therefore, dust management on the site is going to be considered significant. If this was a site that was away from anywhere and there were no residential properties within miles in any direction, it might not be quite as important. But the views of interested parties here are making it clear that actually it's something that needs to be considered and is a significant issue. And then finally, when we're thinking about how we may protect or maybe improve some of these, we do have to think about cost savings. Now, we can't just rule things out because they're going to cost too much. However, when we're doing a scoring system, one of the things that I've seen people use is, what is the cost benefit of actually looking at that as a way of identifying which are the things that we should actually think about. Is it something fairly cheap that's going to have a big impact, or is it going to have minimal impact but cost us a lot of money? So some sort of a cost benefit analysis can also be used But I would not be happy as an assessor if I found out that there was something really, really significant that you were ruling out simply because it was going to cost a bit of money. That's not what it's about. As I've said, there's no standard methodology for determining significance. What we argue is it should be systematic, there should be some logic behind it, it should be consistently applied, it needs to be accurate. So in other words, my expectations of what I would see if I came to your site. So if you're an engineering company, I've worked in engineering companies for years, I know what I would expect to see as a significant impact, significant aspects and associated impacts. If that's what you'd come up with, I would probably argue that that was fairly accurate. There may be a little bit of, well, maybe that's not the highest and that's second, that's number 3, that's number 4. But generally, I would expect the top half dozen to be what I expected them to be. So I would argue that's accuracy. And they need to be objective. So that's the other issue, that we try and avoid any subjective. So for instance, I've been to a number of clients over the years where, and it's sort of, I alluded to it earlier, their number one significant impact was down to aspect and associated impact was down to use of paper in the photocopier. There were much greater things going on out there, but somebody in the office had a bee in their bonnet about photocopying paper and the use of it, and that ended up being the number one significant impact. So that's somebody being subjective and not being objective. But most people, 90% of those that I visit, use some sort of scoring mechanism. I have seen people use other sort of scenario-based or questionnaires. I can remember going to one client and they were using Post-it notes. So on the board, they'd put around the room, there were a whole number of different things, different aspects, different impacts, and they were asking people to vote. Now that's fine, but you do start to bring in subjective views if you're not careful. So that can be one methodology, but generally these days the scoring mechanisms are the ones that tend to be used. Now, I'm going to come back to life cycle because this has prompted both within NQA and outside of NQA a little bit of discussion just recently. So, in addition to the current requirement to manage environmental aspects associated with procured goods and services, organisations need to extend their control and influence of the environmental impacts associated with product use and end-of-life treatment or disposal. One thing that the standard's now saying. I reiterate, the standard does not require a full life cycle assessment. A life cycle approach should be considered, and the important word is considered. In the appendix to 14,001, there is a definition of key concepts, and it defines the word consider and the phrase take into account, and it explains the difference. So, consider is defined as you have to think about it. However, the end result can be excluded. If it says take into account, again, you have to think about it, but you then have to do something with the end result of whatever it is you've been doing. So the important thing here is to say that the life cycle should be considered, but can be excluded. Now, what we would argue, this was the discussion we had within NQA, in order to exclude something, we actually want to see that it's been considered in the first place, and that's what the standard actually says. That you have to consider it, you have to think about it, but you can then choose to exclude it. So we would expect businesses to say, these are what we consider to be our life cycle impact. So it's the transport, maybe bringing goods towards you. It's raw materials. Now, one of the other important considerations, or one of the other important things to think about is, again, the standard says we only have to think about things that we can control or we can influence. So when this first question first came in, lots and lots of people said to me when I was doing webinars around this 2015 standard, which this was a new requirement. How far upstream and how far downstream do we have to look? And I immediately came back and said, think about control and influence. Because if you're buying in metal castings, you cannot control or influence where that iron ore was mined somewhere in the world, shipped to the UK, melted into iron and turned into steel and then delivered as castings. You cannot control where that iron ore was mined, so you can ignore it. Likewise, downstream, one of the big sort of discussion points at the moment is if I'm making a consumer product, if I'm making kettles, the use of those kettles by somebody in their kitchen, can I control or influence that? No, I can't. So therefore, I can control how they're delivered. I can control the packaging that's in them. I can control how they're manufactured, put together, and how easy are they to recycle. I can control all of that. How a person uses them to boil some water for a cup of kettle for a cup of tea or a cup of coffee cannot be controlled. But there are certain things that I, as a manufacturer of kettles, can control and influence. Not the use, but I can control the packaging. I can control how the packaging can be disposed of. As a retailer, we now have to start providing facilities for collection of electrical equipment. So there's lots and lots of things that we can do as part of a life cycle approach to aspects and impacts. So as it says there, the standard specifies that you should consider a life cycle perspective in relation to appropriate controls for procurement of goods and services. Who are we buying them from? Are there better environmental options? Considering the environmental requirements in the design process, just what I've been talking about. Development of a product, how it's delivered. You can perhaps on some certain products influence how they're used, but particularly disposal and end-of-life treatment. It talks about communicating relevant environmental requirements to external providers. So again, one of the food companies that I work with, in fact, I was auditing them last week, supply fresh product to Tesco. The packaging that's now used, not the packaging that the items and the vegetables themselves come in, but the plastic boxes are recyclable. So they fill them at their site once they've packed the veg into bags. They put them into these green plastic boxes. They're then put on pallets, shipped out to Tesco's. Tesco's use those for point of display sale. They just put them straight out on in your little potatoes or your carrots out of there. When they're empty, they go back. So that is almost like a closed loop packaging solution. And that is something that's been considered as to try and cut down on the environmental impact of use of packaging for delivery and possibly end-of-life treatment. And has come about through a communication process between the two organisations. And then providing information about potential significant environmental impacts during delivery or during use and end of life. How many times now have you bought a product that might have batteries in? And there's some information on that product. It might show a wheelie bin with somebody with the lid up and looking as though they're putting the battery in, and there's a big X through it. So there's information now that you might have to think about providing. Because again, it's part of you. You can influence. You can't control. At the end of the day, if somebody's going to stick that battery in a bin, you can't do anything about it. But you can try and influence their disposal. So this again, just a little bit of a flow chart of life cycle perspective. Raw materials, procurement, manufacturing process, distribution, use, and disposal. And again, the way I always describe this in terms of thinking about how far up the chain or down the chain we go. If you're crossing a road, you look left and you look right, and you will start to walk across if it's clear. You can only make your decision on what you can see. You can't see around the corner. That's out of your control. That's out of your influence. So you make a decision on the information that you have. So things that are around the corner that you cannot influence, you cannot control, you cannot make your decisions based upon that. So that's just showing us a little bit about that life cycle perspective. And again, just a little note there that shows that actually for a lot of components, for a lot of products, the biggest energy use, or the biggest environmental impact, should I say, including energy use, is actually in their use. So production, distribution and disposal are fairly small compared to the life cycle, the use of a product. So we need to think about, this is in a different standard, but another part of ISO 14000 series, ISO 14044, talks about consecutive and interlinked stages of a product or service, from raw material acquisition through to final disposal. And these are roughly the percentages. As you can see, the vast majority comes within the use of something. So if we can, and we can think about some of the downstream aspects of what we do, then we're going to get sort of the biggest benefit. That's all I was going to say. Obviously, we don't just drop you here. If you want any further information, you can get hold of us via any different methods: calls, websites, emails, blogs. We feature quite heavily on LinkedIn, and it should say X now, I guess, as opposed to Twitter, but we all know what we mean. And we produce a monthly sort of e-magazine called In Touch. What I haven't done, and I'm quite happy to do that, is give you my personal email address. You won't see it on any of the slides, but I'm more than happy outside of here to engage with people if you have any further questions. If you suddenly think later on today, oh, why on earth didn't I ask him that? Bob me an email. So all our emails in NQA are somebody at nqa.com. So I am richard.walsh at nqa.com, richard.walsh, W-A-L-S-H, at nqa.com. So a couple of questions left. Hi, Gary. Hope you're well. Gary's one of the people that I audit. How would you include the impacts of climate change in your aspects and impacts register? Not the impacts you have on climate change, but the impacts it has on you, i.e. severe weather, or is this just an emergency or abnormal situation? I think I started to cover some of that. That you're quite right, that when you are thinking about abnormal and emergency situations, then weather is one of the biggest drivers now of people's abnormal operations, either through increased energy use because of heating or cooling, or even emergency uses because of flooding. If you're in a floodplain, then that might prompt you to have to think a little bit more. You know, I have clients now who store things on the first floor. They have very little at ground level because the site floods so often. There's a company I've worked with that produce false floors, a bit like false ceilings. You can now get a false floor where your floor is lifted up maybe a meter on legs, and it allows a building to flood without it affecting what's going on in the office. There's lots and lots of things you can do. So I think, Gary, that's how I would say that wild weather, increasingly wild weather, I would treat as a either an abnormal aspect or even emergency, dependent on what is actually happening. Right, are compliance requirements always significant even if the risk is low? No. All I was trying to say there, Serena, was that some people take the view that because it's a legislative compliance issue, then by default it is significant. But that sometimes is too broad a brush to use. and I wouldn't necessarily say that's the best way. I think it's a good place to start. It's a good way of sort of identifying sort of the things that could well be. Look at the legislation that applies to what you do and think about those activities first of all, but I don't think it's the only thing. Can we buy the video? No, it's free. Yeah, if you go onto our website, I don't know, I apologise, I don't know quite how to pronounce your name, Soto. Go onto YouTube, search for NQA, and all our videos are there free of charge. Right, you mentioned, Richard, this is from Emily, you mentioned that companies often misidentify aspects and impacts. Is there another area you'd say people often get wrong, and what advice would I give? The other area, I think, as well as misidentifying, I think people sometimes go no further than looking at one impact for each aspect. And as I've stressed a number of times going through here, that actually one aspect can have several impacts. So again, the one I've quite often used is use of diesel. I've got an electric car now, but prior to that, I had a diesel car. So if I think about my car and think about the aspect of that use of diesel, it's a natural resource. It's pollution. It's kicking out exhaust fumes. It's providing, particulate matters. It's had to be refined somewhere. There's probably half a dozen legitimate impacts associated with that one aspect, and I think, as I say, some people tend to look at an aspect and just think of one impact, and actually you need to think about more. So that would be another area that we think about. Can you share it with others? Yes, you can. Of course you can. As I said, these videos are completely free. You can use them in any way you like. You will get copies of the slides, and yeah, in fact, the client I've been working with today, I've suggested that they look at all of our videos, and there were dozens and dozens of webinars on a wide variety of subjects. Most of them last between half an hour and an hour. A lot of people use them as CPD, and we would encourage people to do that. If you've got a spare half an hour, spare 40 minutes, just go on there and have a look and say, oh, there's a webinar on, I don't know, carbon neutrality, or there's a webinar on health and safety risk assessments, or there's a webinar on, I don't know, working at height or something like that. There's a whole range of different subjects, and they're free to watch, and we make them available. It's part of our marketing activity. We hope that you'd watch them and like them and maybe think, oh, I quite like the look of NQA. So anyway, thank you everybody for spending time with us today. I think most people have stayed to the very end. We are 4 minutes over. I said I'd try and keep it to within an hour, so we just about managed that. So thank you for your time. As I say, early next week you will get an email with the slides attached as a PDF, and there will be a hyperlink to the presentation itself. So thank you. Have a good afternoon or a good rest of the day wherever you are, and hopefully I might catch you again on another webinar. I do about 7 or 8 a year, if not a bit more. So hopefully you found it useful, and what we're trying to do is to go back to basics and think about all these different sections of the standard, and think about what do they actually mean and how can we use them to actually help us improve our impacts on the environment, because that's why we're doing this. So thank you very much, and have a good day.